Right, so yeah, I'm going to start kicking things off with what's your favourite place that you've been able to go to thanks to your role as a sports reporter and journalist that you wouldn't have been able to go to if you weren't?
Okay, that very good question, Dawson. I have been lucky with my job, especially on the cycling side of things, because the road cycling, the professional circuit, is all around the world. You get to go to some really cool places. The race I do love is the Tour de France. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Tour de France, but it's this crazy race in France where it's almost like a small city going around the whole of the country. And you have 21 stages, and the cyclists probably cycle about 3,000 kilometers over 21 days, up through the Alps, up through the Pyrenees. And we have one stage once where I was lucky enough to get in a helicopter, and there was a mountain pass called Alpe d'Huez. Now, Alpe d'Huez is famous for what's called switchbacks. So they're like hairpins. So you might go forward and then you turn back 180 degrees. And this mountain is famous in Tour de France folklore. And there's a corner called Dutch Corner where hundreds of thousands of fans from the Netherlands, so Holland, come and follow their riders. And I was in the helicopter looking down, and on this beautiful mountain, you had the green backdrop, but in front of that, you had this sea of orange, which just looked absolutely amazing. So that's always a pleasure. That tends to be an annual one. Also went to Tunisia in sort of the northern parts of Africa. I think we were there for 2 days, really, to see how bikes were made. So that was pretty incredible. But yeah, you do get some very good gigs for the job.
Cool, thank you for that. Now today I think we're starting at Priory with Shannon. Do you have a question?
Yes, my question is, if you could go back in time and give your younger self one top tip, what would it be?
Oh, that's a fine question, Shannon. In all honesty, it probably leads in from the previous question, because I do a lot of covering the road cycling. The sort of epicenter, the center of road cycling is France, because so much of the sport is based around this one big race. Now, I did study French when I did my GCSEs, but I didn't do that well at it, and I never really focused on it ever since. Because when I was younger, I was like thinking, well, I don't think I'm probably going to move to France. You know, probably a bit lazy. A lot of people speak English. I didn't really see the merits of learning that language. But as I've got into cycling, you know, most of the riders, whilst they do speak English, you know, the key to the journalism is to get into a story, isn't it? You want to hear the tales from the riders, and you know, the ones that, you know, don't speak English that well, which they shouldn't need to necessarily. They've obviously got their own languages. A lot of them on the French side, so it's quite hard to get the detail you want to produce a good story if you can only get a few lines. So yeah, I think if I went back, I would maybe focus on the language a little bit more, I would say.
Brilliant, thank you for that. Now we are going to Tamsin. Do you have a question?
Yeah, so my question is, how are you finding sports stories at the moment with no sporting events going on?
Slow, but no, it's not too bad. It's my job tends to be a lot of it might be a lot of background stuff and maybe training wise. So I'm still managing to write features, but they are slightly different. So I've just written a feature, or in the middle of writing a feature for a magazine called Cycling Plus, which is about training in lockdown. But we put a bit of a twist on it. So instead of saying, you know, what are you doing in your garden, you know, on your bike, we focused on characters who have always used to training in lockdown. So I spoke to a soldier who might have been in Iraq or Afghanistan and they can't get out on the bike. I spoke to an astronaut a couple of days ago. He was very cool. So, you know, telling us how they exercise at the International Space Station. And he was great. He was like, because if you don't exercise up there, your body sort of almost atrophies. So basically your muscles shrink, your bones sort of lose their density. So they've got to exercise several hours each day. So he was really cool. And I also spoke to probably the most interesting one, who used to be an armed robber. So this gentleman ended up in, I think it was a prison called Belmarsh. I think it was Belmarsh, Belfield, Belmarsh in London, because of this armed robbery. Now, Belmarsh is what they call a Category A prison, so it's sort of maximum security. So you get some pretty unpleasant people, should we say, in this prison. And he was saying how he'd be in his cells for 23 hours a day, and he actually sort of just exercise sort of saved him. So he would say he had a circuit routine in his cell. And basically in the cell he had a chair, he said a cardboard table, and his bed. So he would basically do circuit training in his prison cell. So he might start with 10 press ups, and he said like about, I don't know, 1,000 days later or something, he was up to like 1,000 press ups. And actually he was really interesting because he's out of prison now, and that saved him. You know, now he's teaching sort of youngsters in, you know, maybe some more deprived parts of London, that there is a hope for them. They don't need to turn to crime. And he's a really good athlete as well. He's a top Ironman. So he swims, bikes and runs. So yes, there are challenges, but you know, some of the magazines I work for, and I hope to do it as well, we're trying to be creative and come up with interesting stories.
Thank you. Now we are moving on to World School. I think we're starting with Olivia. Do you have a question?
Hi, yes. I was going to ask you, did you always want to be a sports journalist? And if so, why? And if not, what were your other ambitions?
Oh, another good question. I'd probably say, perhaps like a lot of sports journalists, I was probably a failed sportsman to a degree. So when I was young, I always wanted to be a professional footballer, I guess, or at least a footballer. And you know, if they paid me to play football, that would have been the dream. So as I always bore my family with, I think it peaked when I had a trial for Watford, who play in the Premier League, when I was young. And I didn't get selected, so I was officially not good enough to be a professional footballer, unfortunately. But I always really liked basically writing, and I always liked sport. So I guess when I was younger, maybe your guys' age, I might not have, you know, you lot are obviously really proactive and you love what you're doing, you love the journalism side. I wasn't sort of so aware, I guess. So I knew I liked sport, I knew I liked writing, but I probably didn't sort of dream of being a sports journalist. I might not have even known that such jobs existed. But my degree, when I did it in Worcester, so up near Birmingham, it was a mix of English literature and sports science. So it was quite an unusual combination. But I think the signs grew and grew that, you know, maybe the sports writing was sort of ultimately, I guess, what I wanted to do. My mum and dad always wanted me to be in the RAF because they said you got good money and a good retirement package. But unfortunately for them, I went to the sports journalism route instead. Thankfully as well, because I do really enjoy what I do.
Cool. Thank you. That was brilliant. Now we are going to Joel from Will.
Hi.
Hi,
I play football and I need to keep up my fitness. What are your top tips? To keep up fitness during the lockdown?
Good question. We've got a bit of feedback there, Joe, but was it about keeping fit, yeah, through lockdown?
Yeah.
Okay, and are you a footballer, Joe, did you say?
Yeah.
That's a very nice map you got in the background there, Joe. Where are you?
I'm in my dining room.
Ah, very nice. So yeah, I'd say that. Have you got a garden?
Yeah.
Okay, so what I'd probably do if you're really into football now, sort of a lot of the people I speak to and where like training has improved over the years, is they make the training more specific. So you could go off for, like, in your hour, you could go off for a jog if you want, which would be a good, exercise. But, when you play football, you'll have moments of, you'll be sprinting, and then you'll be jogging, and then you might do a bit of walking. So what you'll find is the top teams, whether they're Liverpool, Man United, they try and make the training as specific as possible to what will be on match day. So you could, just do, if your garden's long enough, sort of 20 sprints, but then maybe, walk in between every 5 or something, and just trying to replicate what you might do in a match. And what position do you play, Joe?
Striker.
Striker. Ah, right. So you're a goal scorer, yeah?
Yeah.
So you find, and I'm sure you know this from when you're playing, that when you're a striker, it's really important that you have that initial acceleration, isn't it? Just to get ahead of the defender. So if you can just be a bit quicker by mind and body, you can just get ahead of him and hopefully score a goal. So with you could really just practice almost like Usain Bolt, your little starts. So really trying to focus on that real acceleration. So that would probably be a good start. But I'd also say, stuff like, whether you do press ups, sit ups, if you've got a skipping rope, anything like that really to get your heart rate up. And I mean, if you have apps and that, or, like these Fitbit watches, obviously you can use those and just measure how hard you're sort of exercising. You can download apps to, analyze it after, just to keep it interesting. So, but I think very much body weight as well, Joe. Like I said, with the press ups, keep strong, and time the football season comes round again, hopefully you'll be in peak condition.
All right, thanks.
No worries, mate.
Great, we've had some great questions so far. We're now going to Archie from Well. Oh, sorry, I think your mic's on mute, Archie.
Hello.
Mm.
What triathlon?
Hello, Archie.
Hi. What triathlon did you, in a way, find the hardest to write about?
Oh, the hardest to write about. Now, there's that's a cracking question. They are quite hard to write about triathlons at the time because the nature of the sport. Do you know much about triathlon too, Archie?
Not a lot, but I know what like's in them, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Biking, swimming, and running.
So basically, it's essentially the swimming, the biking, and the running. It can be different distances. So it can start at, say, sprint distance, which you might swim 400 meters, then you might cycle 20 kilometers, and then you run 5 kilometers. And it's all continuous. So you go from one to the other to the other. And this can go up to like Ironman. I don't know if you've heard Ironman. You swim for 3.8 kilometers, cycle 180, and then you run a marathon. So it's a pretty crazy sport in many ways. But it's the problem is, as a journalist, if you're writing a race report, you'll be stood in one place, like which might be the start of the swim. You see the athletes go out on a swim, and then you sort of wait for them to come back, and then they've gone for another 5 hours on the bike. You see them briefly again in transition, and then they've gone for another 3 hours on the run. So it's quite hard to write it there and then beyond sort of describing, the action off maybe the split times you get in.
Yeah.
I think where you tend to get the detail, Archie, is sort of after. So if you can speak to the athletes, ask them about their race, try and capture a bit of the emotion, which were the hard bits, which were the easy bits, any unusual tales. I think one of the strangest races that sort of covered was a Deca triathlon. So we talked about Ironman, where you might swim 3.8 kilometers. Now these guys, they would swim 38 kilometers, then they would cycle 1,800 kilometers, and then they would run 10 marathons in a row. And it's quite, Archie, I think that's an understatement. Yeah, that is quite a lot. But you would interview the athletes in that, and they would be telling you tales of how they would hallucinate. And I remember this one lady, she said it was about 3 a.m. and she was running in the dark, but she started seeing gravestones in the middle of the road. So she was zigzagging in and out of these gravestones along the road, and thankfully it was hallucinating. There wasn't a cemetery sort of misplaced in the road. But yeah, I would say you really need to speak to the people doing the event as soon as you can after, while the events are fresh in their mind. And then how does it work sort of with you, Archie? Do you sort of record interviews and then play them back and type them out? Or?
I tend to just write notes, and then when I get back to either school or home, I write them on paper and then put them into our news portal.
That's a really good way of doing it. Well, that's cool. Yeah, I tend to either take notes or this tends to be my best friend, Archie. I don't know if you can see it. It's my slightly battered dictaphone. So
Yeah,
I must.
just about.
There's something called shorthand. I don't know if you've been sort of aware of shorthand, which it's like you were saying, you make notes, but almost through symbols. Unfortunately, I never learnt this skill, but I think for some of my colleagues, that's been a really useful skill at things like races, because you can just, someone might, you obviously speak, far more words than you can write almost. So if you can get the words down that they're speaking very quickly in symbol form, then look back, that's another good skill to learn. But yeah, interview the protagonist, note what the conditions are like, and then anything you observe, Archie, as the race goes on, just to try and capture the emotion and the spirit of the day.
Cool. Thank you.
No worries.
Great. Now we are going to Josh Keys from Well.
Hi there, James.
Hiya, Josh.
My question is, whilst being a sports journalist, what is your opinion on the new eSports competitions that sports stars are taking part in during COVID-19?
Well, I'm probably showing my age here, Josh, that I don't know too much about eSports, but I am aware that there's like a Premier League competition going on, isn't there, at the moment? Is that right? And I think Trent Alexander-Arnold is one of the players, and is he in the semi-finals, I think, or quarterfinals? But I know it's becoming very popular, and like in the world of cycling, they're starting to hit eSports as well. There's an online package called Zwift. So basically, you turn your bike into a static trainer. So you clamp a device called a turbo trainer to the back wheel. So you turn it into like an exercise bike, and then you link up to this online software called Zwift, which is like a gamification of cycling. And I know that has proved sort of really, really popular, especially in lockdown. And I guess it's the same as you find, you'll know far more about this than me, Josh, but in football, what I was surprised about, there seems to be quite a growing spectator audience. Would that be right? That people are just watching other people play maybe FIFA? And you're finding this a little bit in cycling, because all the races have been cancelled. They're sort of having online races. So you might have the big teams. So Team Ineos in cycling are probably the equivalent of, say, Manchester United or Liverpool. So that they had a race amongst themselves the other day, and in cycling terms, it was quite a big audience. So clearly there's a market there for it. Do you play yourself, Josh?
Not really, no.
Okay. No, very wise. But it's yeah, I think it can be good. It can be good for a sport. I think if people sort of balance, the esports and the real sport. But yeah, I can see it's definitely a growing sector of the industry.
Great, thank you for that.
No
just following on from that, apparently Mrs. Humphreys at World School, one of our schools in the PLT, uses shorthand when she's in meetings as well.
Okay.
And I suspect Mr. Dean and Mr. Dando may have had to learn it. I don't know.
Yes, I learned it. It's invaluable, really. I was fortunate that I was absolutely hammered on training when I was a trainee journalist, and they really went on speed for us. So I was lucky. I got up to 140 words a minute, and that's absolutely been so important to me during my life as a journalist, both as a newspaper and a radio journalist, to be able to sort of take notes and report people speaking almost as quickly as they speak. You can take a note, but it takes a lot of practice, but it's a skill that's definitely worth learning if you are thinking of becoming a journalist.
Great, thank you for that. Now we are going to Josh Lloyd from Well, please.
Why did you want to be a sports journalist in the first place?
Well, yeah, sort of as per earlier, like I really enjoyed playing sport and sort of reading as well. So not just reading about sport, but general reading, although it did tend to be sort of sport. So I think that was sort of the key reason, really, was just sort of to convey, hopefully, what I see in front of me, and sort of try and entertain people, and bring another dimension, hopefully, to the event that is going on. And tied in with that, what I would say is, if you're really keen on whether it's journalism, sports journalism, whatever form that takes, it's so important to read really as much as you can. Now, I must admit, when I was, young, I read books, and I remember I was particularly into like fantasy books, like adventure books. I think there's one called with Ian Livingstone, and it was a real adventure through the book, and you'd turn to a page and you'd be given options, and it'd be like, well, go to page 22 if you want to go in the tunnel, and page 25 you want to go to the lighthouse, and you either survived or you died, I think. So that always entertained me, but I was also really, really interested in reading magazines. A lot of them were football magazines like Match and Shoot, and then like 442. But I would say, yeah, if you're really keen on sort of, journalism, just read as much as you can, and different styles of reading. And the mind's very clever, because you think, consciously you're only aware of what you're taking in, but subconsciously your mind's taking a lot in as well. So when you're reading on different levels in the brain, you are just picking up different styles of how to write and how to read. But yeah, ultimately, as I said earlier, I felt like I was I didn't reach where I wanted to in professional sport, so I followed up with what I thought was the next best option, and I'm really glad I did.
Okay, that sounds good.
All right, mate.
Yep.
Good luck.
Thanks for that. There's been some great tips so far from James. Now we are going to St Anne's, I think. Tom, do you have a question?
Yes, I do.
Hello.
Good morning, James.
You're right, mate.
What sport do you enjoy reporting on the most, and why?
Oh, well, I've covered, a lot of the sports I've done have been endurance sports, so triathlon, running. I have covered football as well, a little bit of sort of mountain biking, but yeah, it has to be the road cycling side of things again. It's such an unusual sport, really. Like I said, you have the Tour de France, and it seems such a simple sport, really, because you just think, well, whoever's the fastest wins. But in road cycling, especially when it's over many days, like the Tour, when it's over 21 stages and 23 days, I think, with the rest days, it's really complex, and sort of there's a lot of detail in the sport. The more you get into it, so whoever might win one day in a Grand Tour, they might overall finish like 150th, because they're a different sort of species. They might be a sprinter, so they're packed with muscle, whereas someone who wins over 3 weeks would be really skinny, like the Geraint Thomas, who's won the Tour, Chris Froome. So being able to report on what I find is a sport which still interests me and excites me and challenges me, even sort of 20 years in, you feel you're learning something new. I think that's almost a privilege, really, to be in that sport. Also, what I would say, Tom, is my first love was football. Now, I still love watching football, and I have written a book on football. The problem with football now is at the top level, there's so much money in it. It's really hard to get time with like clubs and top players because they've got so much demand on their time. Whereas in road cycling, although it's a big sport, it's nowhere near football. So you can have much easier and greater access to these top riders, you know, and that's a lot of time I'll spend with them. They go on training camps, Tom. So basically they, you know, while it's raining here, you know, in the Southwest in December, these riders will be over in Mallorca on 2-week training camps, and you spend time with them. So you see how they ride, but you also see the teams behind them, like the chefs, the nutritionists, the coaches who train them, you know, the gear experts, and you see like how all this jigsaw is put together. And I'm really interested in that side of things, sort of the sports science side. So yeah, I would say, you know, I've enjoyed a lot of the sports I've covered, but I just think the complexity of road cycling and the emotion, I'd say that's probably the one I really enjoy covering.
Yeah, thank you.
No worries, mate.
That's great. Now we are going to Castle Batch. And Henry, do you have a question?
I do.
Hi, Henry.
My question is, if when I grow up, I would like to be a sports journalist like you. Have you got any tips for upcoming sports writers?
Tips for upcoming sports writers? Oh, wow, that's a very good question. I guess, as I said earlier, the more you read and write, Henry, is, you know, that will stand you in good stead. And we all like to try and sort of find our voice in reading, and I would really try and do that. We all have our own styles, you know, we're all individual, aren't we? We all see the world slightly differently. You know, I'll see the world slightly differently than you, and Nigel will see the world slightly differently than Dawson. So if you find your voice and be confident with what you're writing, I would say that would certainly be a very good start. What I found key, Henry, over the years is building up like contacts and networks of obviously people to interview, people to turn to. So I think good communication helps. You'll be more savvy than this than me, Henry, but probably things like the online side of things, the social media side of things, that's sort of been new to me as I've grown in my career. So you can utilize that in many ways, really, to either link through to your work, to find different angles that you can follow up with your stories. And also, I guess, don't take everything as fact. Make sure you really do your research. You know, if someone sort of says, you know, oh yes, I was playing for Man United and we won the FA Cup in 1976, you know, that's cool, but, you know, always fact check. Make sure you double check it with the records. And was it 76? Oh, actually, no, it was 77. So fact checking is really important. And when I don't know how you sort of write, Henry. Do you write with pen? Do you write on the computer?
Well, I kind of do a bit of both.
Okay. Well, what I find, so a lot of what I do as well, Henry, I might work on magazines. So you might be dealing with other people's copy as well. And whether it's that or my own copy, I tend to work on the computer. But what I would say is essential is always print out what you've written and read over it, because you read it slightly differently, and I'll always pick up oversights or, you know, mistakes in what I've written on the screen, just the way you read things. I would also say, if you really enjoy writing, Henry, you know, it's like everything. Some days you'll find it harder to write than others. But, you know, keep going, to be honest. Some days it can feel like you're wading through treacle. But, you know, if you can just get some words out, you know, the next day you can come back and just look at it again and edit what you've written. It's much easier to edit what you've written than if you haven't written anything at all. And finally, I'd say, you know, have like maybe a notepad or something beside your bed. and a pen there, because actually when we lie down and our brains start to relax a little bit, we can think a bit more differently, and some good ideas for features or the like might come into your head, and you think, oh, I'll remember that in the morning, but often we don't. So if you can just put even just one little bullet point of, yeah, do that, then you can, look back at it in the morning, and that would be a good starting point to crack on with a great feature.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Emery, that's cool.
Great. Now we have Sophie from Castlebatch as well, please. Do you have a question?
Hi, James.
Hiya, Sophie. You all right?
Yes, thank you. Why did you decide to become a writer after your sports science career?
Oh, well, so yeah, so my degree was a strange mix of English literature and sports science. So, in the morning you might be reading Charles Dickens, and then in the afternoon you might be taking blood out of a road cyclist's finger as you were measuring their sort of blood lactate levels. Now, what I think I found was I was probably stronger. I guess my interest was probably greater on the sports science side of things, but the English, the teachers said I always wrote, reasonably well. So that was probably why the sports science consumed me regarding the actual content, but the English literature was also invaluable because it sort of taught me to write, really, the different structures and, the rhythms of a piece. But yeah, the sports science, but that held me in good stead, because actually, unlike, I think Nigel, did you went through like journalism school? Was that correct, or the BBC?
Yeah. I mean, I did my A levels and then decided that I didn't want to go to university, so I joined the local paper in Western-super-Mare when I was 17. So I went straight from A levels to journalism.
See, so Sophie, I went a different route. I sort of went in the back door, because although I went to university, I didn't have sort of formal journalism training, which shows there are various ways to get into sort of this sort of profession. But that's I sort of then sidestepped journalism and went into magazine editing. But yeah, the sports science, I've just always had a real interest in sort of the human body and, the nutrition side of things, and, what's the best way to train for a different sportsman, and the sports psychology as well. It's sort of quite a rich tapestry, really, of how these top athletes are formed. So when I was growing up, sports science was quite a new field relatively. And I guess when I went freelance, I sort of thought there was a bit of a gap, bit of a niche that I could carve and focus on that side of things. And that's key as well. If you can find a fresh angle, editors that will be looking to commission new stuff for their magazines, hopefully they'll turn to you. And if they trust that the words that they'll get back will be new and exciting to the readers. But yeah, that's probably why I ended up as mainly a sort of sports science writer.
Okay, thank you.
No worries.
Thank you for that. It's so great to be able to see that there's multiple routes into the career that you're in now. So people who want to be like you can do it in multiple ways. Now we have Ruby from Castlebatch as well. Sorry, I don't think we can hear you at the minute. I don't know if that was me or...
No, we've got a problem there with Ruby's sound. Should we move on to Emma? We'll go back to Ruby if we can.
Yeah, good idea.
Emma, is that all right with you to... Yeah.
Emma. There's two Emmas.
Okay, we'll go for Emma Hewson then.
Yeah.
Hi. What were your hardest challenges in getting to where you are today?
the hardest challenges, I think it was probably getting the sort of the first step on the ladder into sort of the profession I'm in now. So when I finished university, looking back now, it was very a little naive. I think because I got a degree, I thought, you know, I went home to live with my mum and dad back in Exeter, and I think I was probably waiting for someone to knock on my door and give me a dream job. And then I realised 6 months in that probably isn't how it works. So a year after university, I was working at a company called Southwest Water, which I was processing people's direct debits, their monthly payments to the water board, which it was as boring as it sounds. But I mean, it gave me money for sort of 12 months. And then I realised sort of, you know, if I moved a little further north to Bristol, hopefully there'll be a few more opportunities and I can work out what I want to do. So I moved from Exeter in Devon up to Bristol, and I was on a graduate scheme probably for only about a month with, do you know, like Royal Bank of Scotland? Again, I seemed to be dealing with people's finances and processing various forms, and after a month I was like, oh, I really don't think this is what I want to do. And that's when I started to really think about things. I thought, well, the sports journalism side is what interests me. And I saw this little advert in the local paper turned out to be an editorial assistant for this triathlon magazine. I didn't know a huge amount about triathlon at the time, but I then really knew that, yeah, this is, you know, I was probably 22 or something. I thought, this is, you know, I can throw myself at this and I think I'll enjoy it. So you had, you know, filled in the CV and you had to do a cover letter. And I did the cover letter, you know, because it's quite hard to make yourself stand out really when you know, you might have 200-300 people that you're trying to get a job over. So I sort of wrote it in the style of a football match report, if I remember rightly. And it took quite a while to write, but it was worth it because they offered me in for an interview. Although, as the editor did say at the time, I did send it in a day late. So Emma, make sure you read the deadline for these applications. But she did relent on me, and then had the interview. I think there were sort of 8 or 10 of us, and then you had another interview, and thankfully they gave me the job. So that was probably the biggest hurdle, was just getting your foot in the door. What I would say, Emma, is, you know, the pay's, you know, it's not bad at all now. But when I was starting off, you know, like a lot of jobs in journalism, the pay to start with isn't great. But you've sort of got, you know, that's secondary at the start. You learn your skills and then the money goes up. So I was earning a little less than I was at the joyful Southwest Water job I had, but it was much more rewarding in many ways. So yeah, if you can just get that foot on the ladder, then you're in it then, and then, you know, you can, you know, you'll have the confidence and you can choose where you might want to go with it.
Thank you.
Great. Now we should be able to go to Emma Latchford. Do you have a question?
Hi. Yeah. Did you always have a passion for writing?
Yes. Yeah, I think I did. I was unfortunately, Emma, I mean, my memory is you know, I don't remember as much as, you know, my wife does. Her memory seems pin sharp, especially about the things I might do incorrectly. But I don't remember, you know, specifics. But looking back, like my mum and dad said, yeah, I would write quite a bit, or I would sort of just, I might watch sort of comedy programs, like Blackadder and that, and sort of write my own sort of scripts. So I think, yeah, I was probably writing far more than I remember. And my dad used to work, he worked at the local newspaper in Exeter called the Express and Echo. And this was years ago. And when, like, my sister and I were small, my dad would take us into work of an evening when it was quiet, and he'd be working, and my sister and I would be writing our reports. And I think computers were quite a novel thing then. That shows how long ago it was. We certainly didn't have one in our house. So we would type it up on that, and then we would do sort of sports reports, I think, about our mates and just make stuff up. So yeah, it's I haven't got, you know, well, maybe I've got more memories of writing than I thought I did, but yeah, I think writing is that's the key. I think the more you write, even if you think you've written something you think is rubbish, it doesn't mean it is rubbish. It might just, you know, on that day you might be thinking, oh, that isn't wonderful, but actually someone else could look at it and say, no, you're completely wrong. That's fantastic. And the more you write, it's like anything, isn't it? If you know, if I was going to train to be the world's strongest man, clearly I'm not, but, you know, I would be lifting weights every day for many hours. And then over years and years, I'll be in a much better position because I'll be, you know, strong as an ox. And it's the same with writing. You know, it's you're training your mind and your muscle to write, really. The more you do it, the more, you know, you'll improve.
Thank you.
No worries.
Great. I think Henry's just got a quick question. Do you have a question?
It's not a question, but I think I know how we can fix how Ruby's not getting, like, not working in.
That's
like,
brilliant. Should we just check if we've got Ruby back with us? Ruby, can you hear us?
No.
No,
He's not.
That's fine. We'll fix that one next time. So sorry
Yeah.
about that, Ruby.
Okay, thank you for all your questions today. It's been brilliant, and thank you, James, for all your amazing answers. Do any of the teachers or staff have any questions?
Nigel, have you got anything you'd like to ask James on our behalf?
Yeah, James, I was interested. I read a couple of your articles the other day, and they were really detailed and really fascinating, really interesting about the science and the training that goes into making a top cyclist. And there's metrics all over the place now, and they're sort of in the public domain. But you know, and we talk about how cyclists can gain advantage over other cyclists by small increments. And I just wonder, because everything's out there now, is there any room, do you think, for at the top level for doping in professional cycling these days, or is that just an absolute no-no now?
Yeah, the puritanical side of me, Nigel, would say, oh no, it's as clean as a whistle. But sadly, I'd be very surprised if there wasn't doping to some form. I suspect what's happened is I've written a few features around this subject, whether it's elite level cycling, but there seems like there could be a problem at recreational level as well with these top recreational athletes. I think what they're doing is, when it's the days of like Lance Armstrong and they were taking EPO and blood bags, they were taking so much because the testing was so inadequate, that once the testing did improve, you know, they did start to get found out. There's certainly rumours of like microdosing EPO. So basically you're taking less than you would in the Armstrong era. And it doesn't particularly show up in, have you heard of biological blood passport?
No.
So basically what came in around the Armstrong era was this biological blood passport, and each rider has to, they give a certain amount of blood throughout the year, whether it's training camps, at races. And what they're looking for are changes in either old blood cells or new blood cells. Because what they're saying is, if you inject, you might either take blood from your body, wait for your blood to reform, and then you add the blood bag, so you've got more blood in your body. So that would show that there's a higher prevalence of O blood cells. Or you would inject EPO. Now, EPO is the hormone to produce red blood cells in your body, erythropoietin. So if you're injecting that and you're producing more red blood cells, it will come up that there's a new skew as well. So you have the old and new. So you have a passport through time. And if there's irregularities, they should show up. The problem they got with the biological passport is you naturally get skews when they go to things like altitude camps, because the oxygen is thinner, so you will produce more red blood cells. So one theory is that cyclists might get around this or cover up their doping by living in altitude tents. So, you know, they'll sleep in an altitude tent. So if there's any questions from the doping control, they'll say, well, I've spent the last 10 days sleeping at 2,000 meters in my bed. So, so I'd be very surprised. What I would say is, cycling has very much been tarnished by doping. To me, it doesn't make sense that a sport like cycling has been tarnished, whereas a sport like football hasn't. You know, it's football's still a very physically demanding sport. The players are playing 3 or 4 times a week at times. So cycling has always had a better doping system or testing system than other sports, or in recent years anyway, which I think is why, you know, they've found so many guilty riders. But yeah, I fear other sports might have a problem, but maybe it's swept under the carpet, shall we say.
Yeah, maybe it is. Okay, that's fascinating, James. Thanks very much.
No worries, Nigel.
Thank you for that. I think Mr. Coles has a question, I think.
Yeah, James, thanks very much for doing this morning. Really fascinating. Probably more, I don't know, but it's fascinating for the teachers, certainly. Great to listen to. Thank you very much. Just a couple of questions, really. You may not be able to answer, really. Do you think Team Sky are clean? And do you think David Walsh thinks Team Sky are clean? And what do you think is going to happen with the Tour this year? And they've postponed it clearly, I guess, but will it be at a different point in the year, do you think? So what do you think about those two things?
Okay, well let's go with the Sky one first. Now, so Team Sky, well, they're Ineos now, so they were, you know, the different sponsors. Good question. I mean, what I would say about Team Sky is they've had two things in their favour that they could fend off doping accusations. One, in as much as they've got the money to bring the best riders in, you know, throughout, despite all these marginal gains talks and this supplement to do this, actually a lot of it is just you've got psychologically and physiologically the best riders on your team. Were you aware, like Chris Froome's case a couple of years ago with the salbutamol? So he was obviously, the spotlight was on him then. I mean, that was sort of rescinded, really. He was never found guilty. In fact, I think the controls they had to find him doping wasn't actually born from sound research in the end. So that was quashed. It's hard to say any team really is free from, you know, maybe the doping, because the thing is, you've also got things like genetic doping, which has hovered on the periphery for years. You know, the more you know about the genetic side, and I think that would be very hard to find. What I would say is the doping is stronger now. I know there are new tests on the horizon. I spoke to this geneticist down at Brighton Uni, and he's developed a test where you would find out if someone's blood doped or taking EPO at genetic level. So that could be a promising one. But I would also say, yeah, another thing Ineos have in their favour is Sky as a sponsor originally, and Ineos now, they're very committed to the sport. Now, cycling's a very fragile business model. It's not like football where you get ticket sales, you hardly get any TV revenue. So it's basically focused on sponsorship. That can provide 90 to 95% of a team's budget. Because of that, if a sponsor buggers off, if they leave, that team can either no longer exist or you seek another sponsor. Now, the fact Sky have been committed for so long, you know, theoretically meant some of these riders aren't as desperate to perform, say, through the second half of the season, because they know the team will be there the following year. What you find, I think, in the last has been a team says, yeah, we're going to fold at the end of the year. All these riders are seeking new contracts to then pay the mortgages, to pay, you know, for the house. That's when, you know, that temptation could arise. Regarding the second part, it's about the Tour de France. Is that right? And so I had a sort of vested interest in this because I edit the Tour de France guide, which is the official one. There's a link up between the organisers of the Tour ASO and immediate media who are doing a lot of work for. So we've sort of suspended that halfway through. Clearly, I got my invoice into the first part of the work I did, but we were expecting it to be moved. So it has been moved to the end of August. It's really hard to say at the moment. Obviously, with the environment we're in, it seems unlikely. But that hopefully the landscape will change, and when it does change, yes, these obviously we're going to have issues we've got to deal with, but some things might change quicker than we think. And I think the Tour de France is so important to cycling. Some teams get 90% of their annual media coverage of that one race, that if they can make it happen, it will. But we'll see. I mean, hope so, because I'll get the second part of my invoice.
All right, thanks, James. I just think I know I have a friend who's cycled up Alpe d'Huez, and I don't think I don't know if you've ever done that, but for the kids here, that is it's incredible, isn't it, that these guys can do it as they do it at the pace that they do it. And when you go to Alpe d'Huez or any of these mountains in the Pyrenees, the Alps, it's phenomenal. They can cycle up it. I mean, I think my friend took a day to do it, and these guys do it in remarkable times, don't they? Just phenomenal piece of sporting history, and how they do the Tour de France. Amazing athletes, doping or not really, but I guess it's just incredible. So thank you for your time. Fantastic.
No worries. No, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you, James, for your amazing answers to all our questions, and thank you everyone for coming. I'm going to have I asked everyone a question? I think that is everyone I've covered. Yeah. I think I'm going to hand back to Mrs. Davis then to finish.
Well done, Dawson. You've been great.
Thank you.
Good work.
Yeah. Fantastic, everybody. Well done. Great questions. Great hosting, Dawson. I'm going to hand over to Miss O'Gorman, who's going to finish us off. Thank you very much.
Yeah, just very briefly, not much to say really, it's all been covered, but an excellent job, I think, from our host Dawson today. Well done. Really clear hosting. Thank you for all the brilliant questions. Thanks to Nigel and Mr. Coles for joining us. But yeah, James, thank you very much for giving up so much of your time today. It's been really fascinating and yeah, engaging conversation, I think, with you. So thank you for being our first sports journalist to join us.
It's been a pleasure.
Appreciated.
Well organised.
Thanks, everyone. And we look forward to receiving your quotes and your stories through, hopefully, on that one.